This is Right to Life Radio with John Gerardi on Power Talk 96.7 and AM 1400, a production of the Right to Life of Central California. And now, here's your host, John Gerardi.
Okay, we're talking about more election stuff because obviously it's kind of the big highlight focus of everything in pro-life politics.
It's the official election season, John.
It is officially election season.
Post-Labor Day.
Post-Labor Day.
You never wear white, and you also always talk about the election. So
and the sky glows orange, and
yes.
you looks like you're. I keep using the comparison that I feel like I'm living in Mordor.
Yeah,
which
or at least on the road there.
I feel like I'm beating that to death.
No,
Maybe I should bring in Silmarillion references that no one would understand, but unfortunately, Mordor is the only one that people understand.
I think, John, that given the stakes of this election and all the craziness we see, I think that is a very apt analogy. If we're not in Mordor, we're at least on the road there.
On the road there. It's okay. The sun looks like the sun looks like a glowing orange, lidless eye that sees all things. People are in despair. They are wearing masks. They are choked by dust, and in all seriousness, the creek fire sounds completely horrible, and it's really bad, destroying a whole bunch of people's property, and it's really horrible. So
prayers
anyway.
for all the people. I mean, John, I know.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you do too. But my wife's family, her not her parents, but her aunt and uncle live up in the Toll House area, and they actually
did they have to evacuate?
Well, first off, they had like a trailer. They were actually living at Shaver Lake in Camp Edison. They were doing like some summer work there. They're retired, but they're just do like some maintenance stuff as a kind of a hobby job. Well, they evacuated from that to their house in Toll House,
right?
And then they had to evacuate from their house in Toll House. So it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
So prayers for everybody if you're listening.
Seriously, that's it's just horrible, horrible. All right. You can listen to the John Gerardi Show for my thoughts on all that. But anyway, this is Right to Life Radio. So I want to talk today about some interesting comments former Vice President Biden and Senator Harris have made about religious liberty. Joe Biden earlier this week had a big thing where he was talking about, I've always respected and I will always defend religious liberty. And
I must have totally missed that because it's so farcical on its face. It just didn't even register.
Yeah, and this led to people saying, like, in what sense possible? So to help us examine this,
I'm sorry. I'm having to catch my breath.
This is the problem with me not running things by you before we talk about it. Jonathan sort of I do some prep, and then Jonathan shows up and we do the show.
Yeah,
and I think it works well because then I can get Jonathan's reactions to things.
I suppose if Biden was once again, if he was doing a joint press conference with Chairman Xi in China,
Xi Jinping,
then yes, hey, look, I have always stood for religious liberty in my country, not your country.
Not your country.
Your country's fine.
Your one child policy,
which
I obviously respect. Yeah, that did not get nearly enough attention.
No,
people got this video from a press conference. I think it was in like 2011 or so, in which it's Joe Biden, the Vice President of the United States, on one side, and Xi Jinping. Jinping or Jinping?
Jinping. Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping, the communist, premier of China. They were at a press conference together, and Joe Biden mentions China's one-child policy, which is their sort of brutal, enforced population control and family planning policy that China imposed on its citizens within certain regions and with various kinds of regulations. And Biden mentions it and says, your one-child policy, which I'm not disagreeing with here, and he makes a very big point in front of Xi to say, hey, I'm not criticizing it,
which is something that
just showing off just that exemplary Catholic moral fiber that
politicians say stuff like that all the time to domestic audiences, like, look, hey, but to say
your differences,
but to say that to
those of you in Minnesota who root for the Vikings, which I respect your decision to root for the Minnesota Vikings.
Yes, but this is so much worse than, it's not like Hillary Clinton being in New York and being like, I'm a Yankees fan now. It's not like when she was campaigning for the Senate it was just so patently ridiculous.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah. So to help us analyze Joe Biden and these noises he's making about religious liberty, I have here a piece written by Kenneth Craycraft, writing in First Things. And here's what he has to say. I presume it's he. I guess most people name it Kenneth. I guess I can never assume.
Don't assume the gender, John.
They say. I actually, for the first time, had the experience of reading an article. Well, I won't get into it. Whatever. All right. Since presidential candidate Joe Biden selected Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate, some Catholics have rightly raised concerns about Harris's hostility. First Things is a largely Catholic publication, by the way, so that's why he's talking about it from the Catholic perspective. Anyway, since presidential candidate Joe Biden selected Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate, some Catholics have rightly raised concerns about Harris's hostility towards Catholicism and her animus for Catholics whose moral lives are informed by church teaching. Coupled with Biden's own antagonism toward Catholic moral theology, Harris's nomination clouds rather than clarifies how a conscientious Catholic should or can vote in the upcoming presidential election. But even more troubling is Harris's perverse definition of religious exercise and the limits of religious liberty. I promise you all, by the way, this is going to get to abortion, so don't worry about it. We're going to get there. And Biden, despite being a, quote, devout Catholic, seems to share Harris's extremely limited understanding of the role of religious faith and practice in public life. For Biden, one can profess one's faith publicly, but should not allow that faith to inform one's policy positions. This is Biden kind of continuing on the Kennedy line of reasoning. For Harris, to do so disqualifies one from public life. This is demonstrated by her tendentious misrepresentation of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. In February 2019, Harris introduced the Do No Harm Act in the U.S. Senate, the purpose of which was to dilute, if not neutralize, the federal 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Okay. Jonathan, can you explain for people what the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is?
The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, as it is often called, was a bill that was passed, believe it or not, by the legislature of the United States in 1993.
Hey, who was president in 1993?
That would be a William Jefferson Clinton.
And which party controlled both houses of Congress in 1993?
John, that would actually be the Democrats in the House of Representatives and also the Democrats in the Senate. And just fun fact, John, noted blue dog Democrat in the House, that squishy moderate who's known for being so conservative. Chuck Schumer introduced the bill in the House.
He introduced it. Wow.
He introduced it in the House. No, but John, don't worry. They fixed it a little bit. They made it a little bit more, bipartisan, or not bipartisan. They made it more inclusive with Ted Kennedy being the co-sponsor in the Senate.
So what did the Religious Freedom Restoration Act do?
So essentially, this had to do with a response from the legislature to employment division versus Smith. At least that was a large portion of it.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court had issued a kind of disappointing case about what standard of review it would give to generally applicable government laws that wound up intruding in some way, shape, or form upon an individual's religious practice. It was this case called Employment Division versus Smith. Jonathan and I think it was maybe the worst Scalia decision.
Yes,
probably his worst decision.
It's his big mulligan. That if you're going to call him a great justice, which I think you should.
Yeah, this is the one big stain on his record.
Right.
And basically, the Supreme Court said for laws that infringe upon people's religious practice, we're going to review it in a way that's very deferential to the government, not in a way that's very deferential, or that is insufficiently deferential to the individual believer. And what Congress did with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was, by statute, change the calculus for how the court reviews those kinds of laws. Basically, so a state, and mostly this has to do with state laws. So basically, by passing this law, Congress said, no. The standard that the courts need to apply is this very strict standard that is very deferential to the individual believer who wants to live out their religious practice. One of the most striking examples of RFRA being used in a positive way was the Hobby Lobby decision. Mm-hmm. Okay, the Hobby Lobby decision. Hobby Lobby was objecting to the Obamacare mandate, which was requiring them to pay for and provide abortifacient contraception for their employees and their employee-based health plans. And the Supreme Court cited RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to say that no, this law is this Obama era regulation unduly burdens. Basically, it falls foul of RFRA because the Obama administration could not show a compelling government interest and could not show that they were acting in the most narrowly tailored way possible to achieve their interest. So RFRA has been extremely helpful for particularly pro-life persons, entities, in order for them to continue to not provide abortion in some way, whether it's a hospital whether it's a hospital that doesn't want to do abortions or provide abortifacient contraception or an employer who doesn't want to pay for abortifacient contraception in healthcare plans. RFRA has been an extremely useful piece of legislation for defending pro-lifers. And as a result, the left now, including many of the same politicians who voted for RFRA in 1993, now absolutely hate RFRA.
People like, again, some of the names that you might recognize. Joe Biden.
Senator Biden voted for
RFRA.
Religious Freedom Restoration.
John Kerry.
Yeah.
Voted for RFRA. Dianne Feinstein voted for RFRA. Barbara freaking Boxer.
Barbara Boxer. Not in the Senate anymore, but still super lefty.
I mean, the types of people, John, that voted for this, it was 97-3 in the Senate. 97-3.
And most of all, signed into law by one William Jefferson Clinton.
Yes.
And it's so funny how Clinton talks about RFRA now. Like Hillary was campaigning in 2016. Hillary was campaigning on overthrowing RFRA with no reference of like, you know, your husband signed it into law, right? And Bill Clinton himself has tweeted, "Oh, we need to get rid of RFRA. Just can't let it stand. I feel your pain." And no one called him out on like, "Hey, you signed that into law, right? Like that was your thing. That
Yes.
you and 99% of every member of Congress." Anyway, okay, so let's keep going.
So the law basically, John, was it was something that at the time was incredibly non-controversial, and I think it's very tragic to see that as states around the country have tried to pass state versions of RFRA, it has bifurcated an issue that was maybe the most bipartisan culture war issue that we could have.
And what made RFRA at the federal level and state levels more controversial is that Christian businesses that did not want to, in their business practice, promote gay marriage were using RFRA as their defense. So, for example, the Jack Phillips, the baker from Colorado, would have used a RFRA defense to basically say, look, I'm a Christian. I'm not going to make a custom cake that specifically celebrates gay marriage because I think it violates my religious convictions, and so therefore I don't want to be forced to have to participate in a gay wedding in this way, or a wedding florist or whatever who doesn't want to participate in a gay marriage. They would have cited RFRA as their defense, and so RFRA gets painted as basically a bigoted, homophobic law when really what it's doing is protecting people's free exercise rights. That I don't want to be compelled in conscience or subject to anti-discrimination law, lawsuits or penalties from anti-discrimination laws, like anti-discrimination laws in hiring or serving people in my business. Like, for example, the same kinds of laws that would apply if you're running a business and say, I'm not serving black people. Okay.
Right.
The same kind of penalties that person would get are threatened to be applied to people who say, look, I just don't want to participate in a gay wedding through my business.
But John, some of our listeners might be asking, what does this have to do with the pro-life issue?
That is a question I meant to answer in this first segment, but we kept talking. So, this is a radio show, though, so you can stay tuned. And for those of you listening on the podcast, you can also stay tuned. And when we come back from the break, we're going to dig into why the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is important, why Obama and Kamala Harris's opposition to it is also important, and why, if they win, it could be really harmful to pro-life people and entities throughout this country. That is coming up next. This is Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400, rtlcc.org to support Right to Life of Central California. This is One Fine Day by the Chiffons.
The inspiration song for a, let me think here, Rene Russo and George Clooney movie, or Michelle Pfeiffer, George Clooney. I always get them confused.
I was just hoping you weren't going to say, "Oh, this was in the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack."
No, it was not.
Which happens every other show.
Rene Russo and Michelle Pfeiffer were both in Marvel movies, but they were.
Oh, for God's sake! Literally,
no, he was.
Find me an actor who hasn't been in a Marvel movie.
So, surprise story. Julie and I were rewatching some of them over the weekend, and Tommy Lee Jones is in the first Captain America movie, which I totally forgot about. I had no recollection that he had this little bit part.
I feel like at a certain point, it's like every person in Hollywood. It's like the only person who hasn't is like Al Pacino.
Well, that's true, but I'll tell you the one that might maybe even be able to draw you in. It's rumored.
It won't.
It's not set yet.
Continue.
It is highly rumored that once we finally if we ever start filming movies again, there are disturbances in the force, to cross my genres, that one Mr. John Wick himself, Keanu Reeves, may be coming to the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
As in the character of John Wick?
No,
or
not
just
the character.
Keanu Reeves.
Keanu Reeves.
Someone? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna say if John Wick actually. I love the John Wick movies, which is probably the least pro-life thing I've ever said on this show. But anyway, all right. Well, thank you for that information, John.
We'll keep you posted.
It has shaken my faith in opposition to all things Marvel, and I will now briefly consider if watching my beloved Keanu if he decides to enter the Marvel universe.
And for those listening at home, it was Michelle Pfeiffer. Michelle Pfeiffer, George Clooney, One Fine Day, a 1996 20th Century Fox production.
There you go.
All right. Romantic comedy.
All right. Well, let's get to the heart of the matter. We're talking about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, which is an important piece of legislation passed by Congress in 1993, signed into law by Bill Clinton, but which provides very important protection for pro-lifers and pro-life entities that don't want to do abortion. And Kamala Harris, in particular, her addition to the Biden ticket is troubling towards that end, because she's such an opponent of RFRA. She had introduced this bill called the Do No Harm Act, which the point of the Do No Harm Act was to basically limit the scope of RFRA, basically take away the federal protection for individuals or institutions and their ability to exercise the dictates of their religious beliefs, including on such questions as abortion. It would prevent RFRA laws, according to this piece from First Things magazine, from First Things that we're reading. This act would prevent RFRA laws from, quote, being used to deny such things as, quote, healthcare access. Oh, those of you who listen to this show regularly know what that word means. Access,
warning.
Coverage or services to which persons are otherwise legally entitled, or, quote, services that the government has contracted to be services that the government has contracted to be beneficiaries through a government grant. In other words, the Do No Harm Act would compel a Catholic physician to prescribe contraceptives or perform abortions if she participates in federal or state reimbursement programs, which means, Medi-Cal, Medicaid, etc. And it would require a parochial school that receives state grants, for example, to employ persons in open same-sex relationships as teachers or even ministers. The full implication of Harris's philosophical understanding of the scope and limit of religious freedom, however, are found in her apologetic for the Do No Harm Act. In a statement on her website explaining the purpose of the act, Harris uses a very narrow definition of religious freedom. Quote, the freedom to worship, this is a biggie, that phrase, freedom to worship, is one of our nation's most fundamental rights, she writes. The First Amendment guarantee should never be used to undermine other Americans' civil rights. The problem, of course, is that, quote, the freedom to worship, is not a First Amendment guarantee. The First Amendment guarantees the free exercise of religion, which has a much more expansive scope than mere worship. This is a classic thing, and especially, and it enters into the abortion debate all the time. Like here, a lot of people on the left talk about the First Amendment and say, and the First Amendment, which protects the freedom to worship. And you need to stop them right there. And you say, no. I'm sorry for whacking this table. Nope. It causes a terrible reverb effect. No. And journalists even will make this mistake. I should put that in air quotes. The First Amendment doesn't just protect the freedom to worship. It doesn't just protect what you do on Sunday. The words are exercise of religion. Okay. And that is a broader term. That's a broader field of protected activity than simply what you do in your church on Sunday. That relates to how you live out your faith Monday through Saturday. Or Sunday through Friday for Jewish people and Seventh-day Adventists. I don't want them to feel excluded. Anyway, the First Amendment is something much bigger than that. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the specific ways in which Harris's policies and other policies presented by other Biden advisors could
Freudian slip.
I know, Obama/Biden, they're the same person. Could very seriously harm the pro-life cause. That's next. Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400, rtlcc.org. Thank you all so much for tuning in. The best music in the greater Fresno area radio market. Please, Mr. Postman. The Postman has been very good to us at Right to Life of Central California because so many of you have sent in donations for our 300 Club. The 300 Club is the best way for you to support Right to Life of Central California for $25 a month. That makes $300 a year. You can support all the work of Right to Life of Central California throughout the year. We send you little goodies and thank yous for your participation in the 300 Club. And I want to go through, I try every show to thank some of the people. So I'm going to start with the Fs, and I go in alphabetical order here. I want to thank some of the people who are supporting us in the 300 Club. Richard and Mary Ella Fairbank, Donna Fleming, Barbara Fletcher. Thanks, Barbara. Shirley Folland, Ernest and Elisa Forden, Gregory and Therese Fraser, Louis Gallagher, Chris and Carmi Janak, Charlene Gahn, Dina Godina. Love Dina Godina. Not least of all because of the, it's just the way the name rolls off the tongue, Dina Godina. Denise Golden, Juan and Antonia Gonzalez, Diane Gonzalez, Charles Gossett, Jamie and Barbara Gray. Thank you, Jamie and Barbara Gray. Hope you guys are doing okay. I know you guys are getting impacted by the fire out there, and hope everything goes well with you guys out there out east on the 168 there. Ron and Linda Grossman, Maria Guzman, Clinton Kelly Haskell, Larry and Renee Holiday. Love the holidays. Charles and Martha Irwin, Patricia Johnson, Domenico and Molly Johnston, Jeff and Debbie Jorgensen, I should say. Richard Coons, your brother-in-law.
Hey.
Yeah, Veronica.
Vanessa.
Vanessa and Richard. There you go.
Yeah.
Joe LaCrue, Philip and Lori Larson, Marla Leal, Taylor and Christina Ledak, Chris and Christina Linneman. And I think that's good. That's a good list for now.
That's a good list.
Anyway, thank you all so much for contributing to the 300 Club. If you want to help support the 300 Club, go to rtlcc.org. There's the blue 300 Club button right there. You can click there, sign up, do a $25 a month donation, and instead of having Netflix and Hulu zap stuff from your pocket to promote horrible programming like Cuties or whatever that movie about kids having sex
don't
was.
Even get me started.
Instead, why don't you give money to Right to Life? That would be
John. Look, if we wanted that, if we wanted to hear about that horrible stuff, we would just read the daily file for the California State Legislature.
Yeah,
so.
That's true. That's true. Anyway, that's a whole other can of worms. All right. So Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, in spite of some noises Biden was making this prior week about respecting religious liberty, Harris in particular has proposed legislation in the Senate that would basically scale back RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is an important piece of legislation that pro-lifers have used to help protect them from laws that would force them to do or provide abortion. And this is where I want to get to a couple of points here. I think I'm going to get to this first, which is a broader discussion about the First Amendment and what it means and how we should think about its protection for free exercise of religion. All right. Now, the greatest PR campaign in human history, and Jonathan knows where I'm going with this already. The greatest PR campaign in human history was the way in which the First Amendment was amended without any vote ever being taken.
Yes.
And that was with the phrase separation of church and state. Okay, many of you remember that, have heard this phrase, know this phrase, separation of church and state. In the United States, we have separation of church and state. Separation of church and state. Separation of church and state. It's part of the law. The United States of America, separation of church and state.
And it's, John, it's amazing to me how normal people, including news anchors and Hollywood actors, musicians, etc.
None of those people are normal, but continue.
I will say normal people. I would even say people that are man on the street people. If you ask them to quote a line, quote unquote, a line from the Constitution, this may be one of the only parts of the Constitution, one of the most famous parts of the Constitution that doesn't actually exist.
Yes. It's
They'll
not
be able
actually
to
in
quote
the most people, if you ask them, hey, is separation of church and state in the Constitution? They'll say, yeah. And that phrase is not in the Constitution anywhere. The phrase comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote, I believe it was after the ratification of the Constitution, wrote to a friend of his who was a Baptist minister.
A group of Baptists called the Danbury Baptist Association.
There you go. Well, thank you, Mr. Baptist,
right.
for your assistance here. Southern Baptist.
That's right.
Excuse me. And basically, it was Jefferson, sort of, who was by no means a Baptist, Thomas Jefferson, but people don't talk enough about how weird it was that he wrote a whole Bible in which he literally physically cut out.
Yeah.
Or he took a normal Bible and physically cut out
the miraculous parts.
All the points where Jesus performed miracles or something.
He created this annotated, abridged version that was like the ethical and moral teachings of Jesus or something like that.
Yeah, where he just cut out any miracles that Jesus did.
Yeah.
Which kind of takes away a lot of the oomph of Jesus, if you ask me. But anyway, if you take away the miraculous divine part. So anyway, the way people talk about the First Amendment is often nonsensical and not consistent with what it actually says. First of all, as we said in the last segment, people talk about the First Amendment. They talk about it as protecting freedom of worship, and that's not what the text says. It says free exercise of religion, which is a much broader category.
Sounds similar, but actually very, very different.
Very different, exactly. And as a result, the left basically wants to, by taking away some of these protections of the First Amendment or of legislation that is supposed to buttress the First Amendment, like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the left is basically taking this position of, we want to force various kinds of pro-life entities, usually, to do stuff that they conscientiously don't agree to do. And you can see this in the way the ACLU has started targeting Catholic hospitals, for example. Okay, the ACLU has been targeting Catholic hospitals, trying to sue them for saying saying in these lawsuits, these Catholic hospitals are discriminating against women by not providing this basic women's healthcare service of abortion. All right, and now those lawsuits haven't gotten anywhere, but they're trying to lay the groundwork for something. You see this in the HHS mandate, which was trying to force Catholic employers, Christian employers, to provide abortifacient contraception through their employer-based health plans, rolling over conscientious objections on that front. All of this is stuff Biden has endorsed. Now, and one of the most disturbing things that I think Biden is, I think, tacitly endorsing, at the very least, through the kinds of people he's surrounded himself with. This is something that Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, has promoted in the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine. And it's about conscience protection laws for doctors. So when abortion became legal, even many pro-choice people like Ted Kennedy thought that there should be conscience protections for doctors who didn't want to do it. And basically he said, I think women should have the right, but I personally am opposed to abortion. I don't like it. And if individuals don't want to do it, we shouldn't force them. So a lot of states, including
Look,
Illinois,
I like receiving communion from my bishop. I like being able to go to mass without people haranguing me. So let's just come up with a compromise.
Yeah. So, and that was the compromise that Kennedy and a lot of other people sort of promoted. And so states passed a bunch of laws basically giving conscience protections to doctors that you don't have to do abortions if you don't want to. Ezekiel Emanuel who is in addition to being Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago's brother, is Vice President Biden's chief advisor on the coronavirus and chief advisor on a lot of healthcare issues. He was a huge key advisor to the Obama administration, basically helped write Obamacare. And Ezekiel Emanuel is this very influential guy in kind of the nexus between public policy and medicine. He's often in the New England Journal of Medicine. He's an oncologist. And he had an article in the New England Journal of Medicine basically saying that we should eliminate all of these conscience protection laws for doctors who don't want to do abortions. And he did this with the mindset of, look, abortion is a accepted medical procedure. You shouldn't be able just to object to doing an accepted medical procedure and still call yourself a doctor in that specialty. So basically, his mindset was, if you're going to be an OB, you have to do abortions. If you don't want to be an OB, that's fine. Excuse me. If you don't want to do abortions, that's fine, but you can't become an OB. That's basically his mindset. His mindset is that OBs should have to do this. They have to be trained in it in medical school, and they cannot just refuse to perform abortions on some conscientious grounds. And he basically thinks that conscientious grounds are sort of meaningless. Basically, his thesis is that the harm to the patient who can't get an abortion is greater than what he views as a metaphysical. He calls it, he sort of talks about it as a metaphysical harm, as if metaphysical harms aren't harms, as if your conscience is not like a thing that's important. And he basically says the harm to the doctor is not as great as the harm to the patient. Therefore, we should force doctors to perform abortions. And so Joe Biden can come out, as he did earlier this week in a press conference, and say, religious liberty is, very important to us, very important to me. But if you're going to force people to directly act in their Monday through Saturday in ways that directly violate the dictates of their religion, the moral dictates of their religion, I don't know how meaningful that really is. Okay, it's not like in the United States, there's no meaningful way in which he's actually advancing religious liberty if that's his position. I mean, what controversies are there where we're forcing people to violate their religion, if not in this central... I mean, it's not like anyone's trying to... it's not like we have goon squads coming in and forcing churches not to have services ever. Oh, wait, actually, that is happening.
Well, and John, you think of this in any other context, because obviously this is all about abortion. You think of the fact if they came out and they said, hey, look, we have Orthodox Jews who really strongly believe in the Sabbath, and some of them have clinics, health clinics, just general, a rural health clinic, not that does abortions, but just does general medical procedures.
Sure.
We think that it is dangerous to have some of these small rural clinics in different parts of the country run and staffed by Orthodox Jews. Look, we're not saying you have to go into general practice medicine.
Yeah.
We're just saying if you're going to go into general practice medicine,
you can't be Jewish.
You have to be open 7 days a week. That's all we're saying. Look, I mean, you can have your religion and you can do whatever you want, but you can't go into this business. I mean, and refuse, quote unquote, to offer care on days of the week.
Sure. Okay. And in a certain sense, I mean, I could possibly see arguments like that if you're like, all right, well, if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you want to be a doctor, but you're never going to do blood transfusions, or is it Jehovah's Witnesses who don't do blood transfusions? I might be getting that wrong.
But it might be Christian Science. I can't remember.
I guess I could see that. I can see how the arguments there would be difficult.
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, to strictly compare the two might almost be giving away the store, because I think our more fundamental case we make is abortion is not healthcare to begin with. Okay, abortion is not a normal healthcare procedure in the first place. first of all, unlike a blood transfusion, it's elective in essentially every single case. Certainly the kind of abortion we're talking about. So that's one thing. And secondly, it's not even healthcare because you're not actually helping correct something that is wrong.
Right.
As opposed to a blood transfusion, which is very clearly in certain cases is healthcare. It is correcting something that's wrong with the body, namely blood loss or whatever. So I think in a certain sense, like, I guess my thoughts on it are a little more complicated than I realized at the beginning of this segment. But nevertheless, to basically say that Catholic healthcare, I mean, let's get to the practical realities of what happens if this Biden policy is worked out to its logical conclusion, or at least Ezekiel Emanuel's policy, which I assume the Biden administration shares. I would be shocked if it didn't. If that policy is brought to its logical conclusion, then you're shutting down Catholic healthcare in this country. And you're basically saying there's no place for religious practitioners to have anything to do with obstetric care. All right, so let's look at a San Joaquin Valley where St. Agnes no longer delivers babies.
Yep.
I mean, is that good for anybody? Is that good in any way, shape, or form to have a San Joaquin Valley where St. Agnes can't deliver any babies? No, of course it's not. That would limit access to reproductive health care, as the euphemism goes, to actual reproductive health care far more than anything else we could do. All right, we'll be back with closing thoughts, including more thoughts on religious liberty and some digs at Thomas Jefferson after the break. Right to Life Radio, Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400, rtlcc.org. You can't hurry love, Diana Ross. You just can't do it. Right to Life Radio, thank you all so much for listening. rtlcc.org if you want to learn more. All right, let's close out today's show. We've been talking about religious liberty, free exercise of religion, which Joe Biden made a lot of noises earlier this week about saying that he's so protective of it. But meanwhile, his vice presidential candidate proposed a law to roll back the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which the whole Democratic Party has rejected. This is a law that has been used by pro-lifers basically to protect individual pro-lifers and their institutions from being forced to participate in abortion in various ways. And we've got this interesting piece from First Things about it. written by Kenneth Craycraft, who I learned is an attorney and a professor at Mount St. Mary's Seminary. And here's what he says. First, he makes the point about how Harris interprets the First Amendment as being protecting freedom of worship, not freedom of religion, or free exercise of religion. And the actual text of the First Amendment protects free exercise, not freedom to worship. And that's a different thing, okay? As he says, in Harris's tendentious reading, free exercise of religion means freedom to worship and nothing more. If the doors of the church are not locked and guarded, or if you are not prevented from praying in your home, you have the full range of, quote, the First Amendment guarantee, and you are guaranteed nothing more. If your religious belief requires you to exercise certain moral obligations or observe certain moral scruples, but you are not prohibited from entering the church, then those obligations can be prohibited and those scruples compelled, all while protecting, quote, the First Amendment guarantee, which is ironic given that actually right now our churches are literally locked for reasons that may or may not be justified. Anyway, free exercise of religion equals private prayer or conviction and nothing else. Thus, nothing else is protected. And Congress, through, for example, the Do No Harm Act, is free to make laws prohibiting the free exercise of religion as conscientious religious believers understand it. Though Biden has not articulated it, as Harris has, his public life demonstrates that he agrees with this truncated understanding of the exercise of religion. By all accounts, his, quote, devout faith has nothing to do with his moral convictions and opinions. Informed by secular left politics, Biden's moral life is separate from and seemingly innocent of any trace of Catholic moral formation, and he would force this view on others through law and policy. For example, Biden has promised to force the Little Sisters of the Poor, an order of nuns who care for low-income elderly people, to facilitate procurement of contraceptives for their lay employees, reversing a recent victory for the nuns in the U.S. Supreme Court. This privatized faith is consistent with Harris's deliberate misrepresentation of the First Amendment. Religion is private and has no role in informing moral conviction, especially as it may bear on public policy. And indeed, religion may be prevented from doing so. So I think I want to talk about a historical thing as we close out the show in relation to that. As he's saying, this view of the First Amendment is basically religion is private and it should have no role in informing moral convictions, especially as it may bear on public policy. I just got through an enormous history of the United States of America. And Jonathan, you can remind me because it was a lot of folks from your side of the street actually got this done. Who are all the people who helped end racial segregation in this country and brought about all the various Civil Rights Act and things like that?
It was mostly atheists and agnostics, right?
Oh,
John?
Of course, yeah.
Lots of secular people.
Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah,
he was
noted,
a doctor of astrophysics.
Well, the Reverend Doctor, but that
because people really respected astrophysicists.
Yeah,
atheist astrophysicists.
Yeah.
Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement was because of religious people applying their faith to the public square. Prohibition of slavery, or abolition, rather, of slavery, was because of religious people applying their faith to the public square.
And John, I will say, it is absolutely true that during the Civil War era, there were, shamefully, some Protestants that attempted to use religion to justify slavery. But they were...
but one thing I will note, actually, which I think is very analogous, there were people who they justified slavery not by referring to faith, but basically by referring to liberal principles, and basically said, well, let individual people decide for themselves whether they want to have. If you don't want to have a slave, don't own it. I mean, Stephen Douglas in the Lincoln-Douglas debates famously was advocating that the Western territories, which was the big sticking point, will the Western territories be slave or free? Said, let the Western territories decide for themselves whether they should be slave or free.
Hey,
and
my territory, my choice.
Exactly. Well, that's a good way to end it. As Frank Sinatra plays us out, Strangers in the Night. This is not a song in reference to Jonathan and I. It's not night. We are not strangers.
That's right.
Anyway, we just like to play a song by an elderly Italian crooner as we close each episode of Right to Life Radio. Thank you all so much for listening. This has been Right to Life Radio, and we will see you next week.